Our true choice is not between tax reduction on the one hand and the avoidance of large federal deficits on the other. It is increasingly clear that no matter what party is in power, so long as our national security needs keep rising, an economy hampered by restrictive tax rates will never produce enough revenues to balance our budget, just as it will never produce enough jobs or enough profits. Surely the lesson of the last decade is that budget deficits are not caused by wild-eyed spenders, but by slow economic growth and periodic recessions, and any new recession would break all deficit records. In short, it is a paradoxical truth that tax rates are too high today and tax revenues are too low. And the soundest way to raise the revenues in the long run is to cut the rates now. The experience of a number of European countries and Japan have borne this out. This country's own experience with tax reduction in 1954 has borne this out. And the reason is that only full employment can balance the budget, and tax reduction can pave the way to that employment. The purpose of cutting taxes now is not to incur a budget deficit, but to achieve the more prosperous, expanding economy which can bring a budget surplus. I repeat, our practical choice is not between a tax cut deficit and a budgetary surplus. It is between two kinds of deficits: a chronic deficit of inertia as the unwanted result of inadequate revenues and a restricted economy, or a temporary deficit of transition resulting from a tax cut designed to boost the economy, increase tax revenues, and achieve, I believe this can be done, a budget surplus. The first type of deficit is a sign of waste and weakness. The second reflects an investment in the future. Nevertheless, as Chairman Mills of the House Ways and Means Committee pointed out this week, the size of the deficit is to be regarded with concern, and tax reduction must be accompanied, in his words, by increased control of the rises in expenditures. This is precisely the course we intend to follow in 1963. At the same time as our tax program is presented to the Congress in January, the federal budget for fiscal 1964 will also be presented. Defense and space expenditures will necessarily rise in order to carry out programs which are demanded and are necessary for our own security, and which have largely been authorized by members in both parties of the Congress with overwhelming majorities. Fixed interest charges on the debt also rise slightly, but I can tell you now that the total of all other expenditures combined will be held at approximately its current level. This is not an easy task. During the past 9 years, domestic civilian expenditures in the national government have risen at an average rate of more than 7.5%. State and local government expenditures have risen at an annual rate of 9%. Expenditures by the New York State government, for example, have risen in recent years at the rate of roughly 10% per year. At a time when government pay scales have necessarily risen, and I take New York just as an example, when our population and pressures are growing, and the demand for services and state aid is thus increasing, next year's federal budget, which will hold domestic outlays at their present level, will represent a genuine effort in expenditure control. This budget will reflect, among other economies, a $750 million reduction in the postal deficit. It will reflect a saving of over $300 million in the storage costs of surplus feed grain stocks. And as a result of the feed grain bill of 1961, we will have 2/3 less in storage than we would otherwise have had in January 1963, and a saving of at least $600 million from the cancellation of obsolete or unworkable weapons systems. Secretary McNamara is undertaking a cost reduction program expected to save $3 billion a year in the Department of Defense, cutting down on duplication and closing down non-essential installations. Other agencies must do the same. In addition, I have directed all heads of government departments and agencies to hold federal employment under the levels authorized by congressional appropriations, to absorb through greater efficiency a substantial part of this year's federal pay increase, to achieve an increase in productivity which will enable the same amount of work to be done by less people, and to refrain from spending any unnecessary funds that were appropriated by the Congress. It should also be noted that the federal debt as a proportion of our gross national product has been steadily reduced in the last years. Last year, the total increase in the federal debt was 2%, compared to an 8% increase in the gross debt of state and local governments. Taking a longer view, the federal debt today is 13% higher than it was in 1946, while state and local debt is 360% higher than it was in 1946, and private debt by over 300%. In fact, if it were not for federal financial assistance to state and local governments, the federal cash budget would show a surplus. Federal civilian employment, for example, is actually lower today than it was in 1952, while state and local government employment over the same period has increased 67%. It is this setting which makes federal tax reduction both possible and appropriate next year. I do not underestimate the obstacles which the Congress will face in enacting such legislation. No one will be satisfied. Everyone will have his own approach, his own bill, his own reductions. A high order of restraint and determination will be required if the possible is not to wait on the perfect. But a nation capable of marshaling these qualities in any dramatic threat to our security is surely capable, as a great free society, of meeting a slower and more complex threat to our economic vitality. This nation can afford to reduce taxes. We can afford a temporary deficit, but we cannot afford to do nothing. For on the strength of our free economy rests the hope of all free nations. We shall not fail that hope, for free men and free nations must prosper and they must prevail. Thank you.
President.